Before we get into the war, I want to review one more time some of the competing ideas about what was the cause of the Great Depression. It's actually relevant to the issue of the war and the relationship of the Great Depression to the war. Now, economic historians understand pretty much that the Great Depression was a complex event and involved lots of things, and so when they stress one thing over another, they're not saying that's the only thing. They also, economic historians are pretty united that raising tariffs, as was done with the Hoots, why do I keep blanking on the name of that? The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Provision Act was the dumbest thing you could possibly have done. But it was a symbol of the way in which the United States, as free market oriented as it was also still committed to an idea of the common good. But anyway, so if we take Andrew Mellon, he was Secretary of the Treasury from 1921 to 1932. He was a member of the Mellon family that was a famous Wall Street banking family. He was quite old when he became Secretary of the Treasury. He had been born in the 1840s, and he became deeply unpopular with the onset of the Great Depression because his advice to President Hoover and his advice to the nation was, quote, this is his words, liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate farmers, liquidate real estate. It will purge the rottenness out of the system. High costs of living and high living will come down. People will work harder, live a more moral life. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up from less competent people, end quote. So, and additionally, he advocated weeding out weak banks as a harsh but necessary prerequisite to the recovery of the banking system. This weeding out would be accomplished through the government refusing to lend cash to banks, and by the government refusing to put more cash in circulation. And he advocated spending cuts to keep the federal budget balanced, and he opposed any and all fiscal stimulus measures. And in 1929 to 1931, actually for over a year and a half, he spent most of his time overseas in Europe, renegotiating repayment of European war debts from World War I, which is where he put his priority. In January 1932, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Mellon, with hearings before the House Judiciary Committee at the end of that, and then when the hearings were over, and it was pretty clear that Mellon was going to be impeached and then sent to the case sent to the Senate, and he'd be convicted. Hoover asked Mellon to resign as Secretary of Treasury and appointed him instead ambassador to the United Kingdom. And he resigned. He served for a year and then retired to private life. He was already quite old. It was this, and then the House of Representatives tried to impeach President Hoover for having tried to prevent the impeachment and removal of Mellon. And then during the Roosevelt administration, Roosevelt subjected Mellon to an intense investigation of his personal income tax returns. The U.S. Justice Department impaneled a grand jury to indict him for a variety of financial malfeasance. Roosevelt hated Mellon because he was, for him, an embodiment of everything that was bad about the 1920s. Mellon tried to defend himself, And there was a 2-year trial that was called the Mellon tax trial, in which he was ultimately exonerated, but he died 2 months after he was exonerated. Mellon's position was based on the assumption that the primary cause of crisis in 1929 had been bad investments, bad decisions, and bad debt, all of which needed to be flushed out of the system. So the people who had made bad decisions were going to have to take a punch in the stomach. Lee Ohanian, who's an economic historian at UCLA, has been the primary contemporary scholar who's defended Mellon's position, arguing that in fact Hoover was the cause. Hoover's efforts to try to make the Depression less painful was the primary cause of the Depression getting worse and worse and worse. And that, if Hoover had followed Mellon's advice, there would have been a quick, very painful but downturn, but followed more quickly by a recovery. It's hard to argue counterfactuals, though they're, and economists bounce different equations back against each other. It is certainly a credible position. But in any event, Hoover, as a politician, was not going to allow the economy to collapse underneath him. And from his perspective, he couldn't allow the amount of pain that Mellon's policies required. And for Hoover in general, the common good was the highest priority. The whole purpose of the economy was to serve the common good and to serve the moral development of the citizens. That, for him, was the basic principle of the U.S. system, not the free market. And he also wanted to protect those who had played by the rules, and Mellon's approach was going to involve a lot of pain for a lot of innocent people. The question of how to mitigate the misery caused by the Depression, that the misery to the virtuous that the economic downturn brought was something that Hoover could never figure out because it was impossible really to separate virtuous activity in the marketplace from unvirtuous activity. Now, the most economic historians have adopted the kind of standard Keynesian position about the causes of the Great Depression and what therefore needed to be done. The basic thing was consumption needed to be increased. The principle is whenever there's a downturn, you have to increase consumption because left to itself, consumption is going to decline, and as consumption declines, so does production and investment. So it's demand-side economics. The government has the first responsibility to increase consumption, and its activities will then lead everyday consumers to resume spending and to increase their consumption, which will then cause corporations waiting for customers to come back to increase their consumption of resources and materials, supplies, and capital investments. And then finally, investors will increase their activity. And it's a very clear, it's a trajectory that from the Keynesian point of view has to go in that order. Government first, consumers second, manufacturers and corporations third, the investing community fourth and final. The New Deal basically pursued this path, but not in any kind of theoretically consistent manner. But by the end of the 1930s, employment and consumption had stabilized, but there had been no great leaps in growth, and there was essentially a sort of permanent 10+% unemployment in the country. Now, World War II brought an end to the Depression, and that could be the ultimate validation. We could see the war as the ultimate validation of Keynesian policies. That is, the government, in order to pursue the war, had to spend, and much of what it was spending on got destroyed in the course of fighting the war, so you had to keep replenishing your munitions, your airplanes, your ships, your jeeps, your tanks, and so forth. We could see military spending as the most successful form of Keynesian economic policies. And that post-war, post-1945 prosperity was based on the Cold War and continued high levels of federal spending, primarily for the military, at least initially. What Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex was this engine that would keep growth in. And if you remember the first slide I showed you, I think it was the first slide I showed you last week, with the percentage of federal spending compared to state and local spending. After 1940, there's a revolution and a centralization of government power and a centralization of economic power into a handful of national corporations. But economic historians more recently have been providing an alternative way of thinking about the relationship of the war and the Depression. In this model, the primary cause of the Depression, what explains its depth and length, was the widespread aging infrastructure, the need of investments in so many areas of the economy, both public investment and private investment. The 1930s was a period of rebuilding, which was largely completed by the end of the decade. And so a boom, according to this model, would likely have occurred in the early 1940s. There would have been an increase in spending and employment. But that boom happened, only the war redirected resources to a particular kind of use instead of the normal kinds of uses, or the uses that had been normal previously. And the war also meant that most civilian spending, or much civilian spending, was deferred for 5 more years. So in 1945, when the war was over, private savings, that is the amount of money in people's bank accounts, was 195% of 1 year's gross domestic product. You had 2 full years of savings in the bank, which then was going to be spent once people readjusted to peacetime. From this final fourth model that I'm talking about, the success of the U.S. economy and the U.S. military was due to the nation having completed its reconstruction in the nick of time. It wasn't the war that finally solved the problems of the Depression. The Depression problems had been solved at the very last moment, and on that basis, the United States was able to enter the war with a burst of productivity no other country could match. Plus, it had no damage to its own domestic economy. We know that the German and Japanese high commands believed that the United States was incapable of fighting a prolonged war or of producing what needed to be produced all around the world. And when they began to realize by the beginning of 1943 how much the United States was actually producing, it was a great shock for them. It was like they were suddenly plunged into a science fiction world that made no sense to them, because the United States was producing at a level that neither Japan nor especially Germany could even come close to matching. And the United States was not only providing for itself, it was allowing the Russians, the French,